पता नहीं मैं कहाँ से शुरू करूं। आपका रिज्यूम बहुत लंबा चौड़ा है सर।
Yeah.
Uh, yeah, good morning everybody. Welcome you to on this day 2 session 1, which has been the resource person is Dr. Dinesh Kumar Nair sir from Navi Mumbai, and then he is an associate professor, Department of English, VG Ways College, Mulund East, Mumbai. And you can reach him at his email and then his phone number, which I will be sharing later. And then his employment summary is 30 years of experience of teaching he has put in, and of course including research as well. And then he is a recognized research guide for MPhil course as well as PhD. And if you want, he has a very exhaustive resume, and he has published 8 books and 24 articles, and he has chaired many sessions as well in international and international conferences. So with this short introduction about today's resource person, I leave this classroom open to him, sir. So please take over.
Thank you. Thanks a lot, Dr. Faiz, for such a generous introduction. And I hope I live up to what has been announced in the introduction. Good morning, one and all. And on a Sunday morning, and it takes more than just commitment to listen to a session, that too on literary theory. Today's session is titled, I also have a PPT to support what I'm saying. And I'm sure Dr. Faiz will eventually share that PPT with all of you.
Yeah, if you don't have any issues, then definitely I would love to
Please
share
do,
it.
please do go
Sure.
ahead, because what
Fine.
I'm going to say is also in a way about lot about sharing resources too. So the title of my session is Eco-Criticism towards Sustainable and Non-Anthropocentric Literary Studies. Dr. Faiz, if you can have the slide. Yeah. Thank you. First, I'll spend a bit of time on clarifying my title and the rationale
Please
behind.
mute all of you.
All right. I'll try and give a rationale for the selection of the topic first. Firstly, the key words in the title are eco-criticism, sustainable, and non-anthropocentric. Eco-criticism, as most of you must be aware, is an attempt to study literature and art with an ecological perspective. And I use the term sustainable here because I believe in 21st century, humanity is largely looking at this issue of what is sustainable and what is non-sustainable. And thirdly, the term anthropocentric. Anthropocentrism is a prejudice that human beings are the superior most species in this world. For centuries, we have been informed by this prejudice, and that has gone into our academics, that has gone into all human enterprises. Now, as we are situated at this very crucial juncture of facing a pandemic at the global level, a concern like ecocentrism or eco-criticism is very significant, because human beings are engaged in a battle with a species of virus which is not even visible. And to put it in a different sense, some of us, maybe by the end of this month or later, could be the carriers of virus. And this pandemic and the era after the pandemic will force us to reconsider a lot of issues, including literature, even human identity. For example, so far we have been largely thinking that an individual is indivisible, and hence what I understand of myself is my probably my corporeal identity, my physical identity, and whatever I do. Now, the awareness of pandemic forces us to think that an individual is not indivisible. An human individual can potentially carry many microbial beings and many microorganisms. That indicates that one body, one corporeal identity itself is so porous that it is made of so many things. That it leads to an awareness that in this universe, in this planetary vision of Earth, everything is connected to everything else. Dr. Faiz, can we move ahead with the next slide? What I intend to do is, I'll try to make my case by maybe spelling out some of the tenets of eco-criticism and the philosophy and the concern behind that. And in the process, I would also invite some discussion later on. I begin with my discussion begins with a poem by Elizabeth Bishop. It's a wonderful poem which in many ways redefines the relationship between the writer who belongs to one species and the object that the writer writes about, which belongs to another species. And it also reverses the conventional subject-object relationship by giving the tree, the poem is titled To a Tree, we can read it very closely and see how this relation, a non-conventional, unconventional relation emerges out of this poem. The poem goes like this. Oh, tree outside my window, we are kin. For you, ask nothing of a friend but this, to lean against the window and peer in, and watch me move about. This part of the poem is a poet who speaks for the tree. And let's see the second part. Sufficient bliss for me, who stands behind its framework stout, full of my tiny tragedies and grotesque griefs, to lean against the window and peer out, admiring the infinitesimal leaves. Now here on, what one finds is an equitable relation between a tree and a human being. Here, the poet is not the superior species, but poet assumes herself to be a companion species of the tree and respects the moral consideration and also the one can say the personality and the identity of the tree. So this opens up somewhere in the 20th century this very interesting connect between the human beings and other species through the medium of literature, which also gives a lot of respect for the identity and the personhood of a tree. We'll move ahead. Can we move ahead and go to the next slide? Fine. One of the basic foundational idea behind eco-criticism are the thoughts proposed by a great ecologist, 20th century ecologist, Barry Commoner, who came up with the very famous Barry Commoner's 4 laws of ecology. One could spend a little bit of time in understanding the volume and density of these 4 laws. Firstly, we have the law that everything is connected to everything else. And I believe situated in 21st century at this juncture, we understand that we are connected not only to the plants and animals around us, we are also connected invariably to the microorganisms around us. That the very unitary idea of self, that I am unto myself, is no longer valid in this situation. The second law says that everything must go somewhere. It means that nothing remains static in this universe. That even all our corporeal identities eventually end, and even when we die, we become a source of food or something for something else. That in nature, everything must go somewhere. And this would also indicate that the amount of debris and waste that we generate are also, and that amount is also accountable to the universe. Thirdly, the idea that nature knows best. Nature has its own wisdom, it has its own time, and it has its own cycle, which probably has more wisdom than the so-called human wisdom, which we understand when we connect to nature probably from a different perspective. For example, all human beings are mostly concerned with what is called this clockwork, our clock time. But there is also a concept called deep time. Deep time is the time that is understood by a tree. Deep time is the time that is understood by a rock or a river, right? Unlike the time that we understand. And to put it in a different perspective, one could even say that human beings are babies on the face of Earth as compared to many species. For example, a crocodile will have more legacy and history than a human being in terms of the entire evolution of the species on the face of this planet. Fourthly, this law is that there is no such thing as free lunch. The very idea of sustainability comes from this, that all resources, most of the resources are non-renewable, and human beings have been the most impactful creatures as far as the resources are concerned. Can we move ahead? The next slide, please. All right. An ecological or an ecocentric approach to art, literature, and culture takes us to an understanding of what has been done traditionally and how those things have been, or those ideas have been replaced in the context of green studies and green thoughts. Because eco-criticism is also known as green reading, it is also known as green poetics, and so on. Traditionally, human beings and all human endeavors, I would say, the entire critical and literary tradition from maybe Aristotle to post-structuralism have been largely egocentric. That is, placing the self or the ego or the personality of the critic or the writer at the center. So there is a slight difference between nature writing of Wordsworth and the nature writing of Elizabeth Bishop. Because in Wordsworth, though one finds a depiction of nature, the poet is at the center of the universe. And this traditional view has been replaced, or necessarily so, under the green initiatives with what is called ecocentric. That understanding that though human beings write, they are only a part of the great chain of this universe. So that is ecocentrism, that considering human beings as a part of the ecology, or the bioregion in which the person lives. Secondly, in a traditional system, all human endeavors and studies have been anthropocentric. Anthropocentrism is that prejudice in species hierarchy, placing human beings at the top of the hierarchy. And this bias anyway begins with many religious traditions. Even if one reads Bible, one finds this great chain of lives where we find a God, and below God you have angels, and then you have human beings, and below human beings you have the mammals, and then the reptiles, and so on. The whole hierarchy of lives or species has created what is called anthropocentrism, and also a kind of legitimacy for human beings to use or abuse any other species for the advancement of knowledge and culture. Now, this anthropocentrism has been replaced. If you look at the right side, we have something called biocentric approach. Biocentric is the love for life, all lives. And as I told you, even the tiniest and the microscopic lives are also very, very important even in 21st century. Thirdly, we have a traditional dualism. Dualism is, is in terms of binaries. We look at many binaries. Life and matter is one binary. We believe that whatever moves is living, while a rock or a river doesn't have life. And this has to be essentially replaced with an idea of pluralism, multiplicity, and a non-hierarchical, non-dualistic approach to world and life. And fourthly, human beings have been considering themselves as owners of many things, because it's very easy for us to talk about owning a house or a piece of a land or an animal and so on. And this, in an ecocentric awareness, this gets replaced with the idea of what is called stewardship. Stewardship is that to consider that we are not owners, but we are the stewards. We have to nurture and take care of a piece of land, because ultimately, like Barry Commoner's law, everything has to go somewhere. Even we will go somewhere, and our own ownership will not come in good stead when it comes to that. So instead of ownership, we have stewardship. And then comes speciesism, that is a prejudice wherein we believe that certain species are superior, and while certain other species are inferior. It's not just that human beings are considered, they consider themselves to be superior, but we also consider certain domestic animals like dogs and even some birds like parrots to be superior to other species of animals. So we do not create a divide between human beings and animals hierarchically, but we also create a divide among the animals. Now this has to be replaced with the notion of eco-spirituality, that is, in the larger framework of this planet, that every life is meaningful, and it is in our connectedness to other lives and other things around us we achieve spiritual well-being. And lastly, there is a notion of setting. Traditionally, we analyze literature. We analyze Shakespeare, for example, a play of Shakespeare, or we might analyze a novel of Thomas Hardy by talking at length about setting. The very word setting evacuates life and agency of the background. Now, this word setting could be replaced with a better term, that is bioregion. Bioregion is that throbbing space where many lives converge, and also it is also made of the larger and smaller lives, and all of them interacting to create what we call as the nature that gets reflected in literature. Can we go ahead for the next slide, please? Fine. So the basic agenda of eco-criticism has a few points. To begin with, all green readings, that is a good term to internalize. And how do we green our readings? It is made of two basic premises. One is eco-criticism, and an extension of that which combines the concern for ecology and the less favored gender, women, in what we call ecofeminism. And if time permits, maybe I will reflect on ecofeminism as well. Then the second point in the agenda is whether one can understand gender oppression environmentally, whether we can understand gender bias, gender oppression environmentally, that is there a comparable situation between the oppression of nature and the oppression of women? That is the agenda largely of ecofeminism. Then, all ecocentric readings since the 1970s that radically question egocentric and anthropocentric reading. So, eco-criticism proposes a radical reversal of the conventional reading with an ecocentric reading. And fourthly, it also aims to trace the intersection of race, gender, class, and environment. These are called the cross-cutting issues in literary analysis, because we cannot study purely the environment in literature, because environment is invariably and very intricately entangled with many other vectors of analysis like race, gender, and class. This means that the world, when it comes to the study of depletion of resources or pollution, world is not evenly polluted. And similarly, both the genders are not equally, both the genders do not equally suffer under pollution. And similarly, not all the classes have the same effect. And so these are the cross-cutting issues that we come across. Can we move ahead with the next slide, please? Yeah. Now, when we look at some of these ecocentric paradigms of critical inquiries, these paradigms point out some pertinent questions that have been now addressed ever since the 1970s in literary criticism and analysis of literary and cultural texts. Let's look at some of these questions. Primarily, the question here is, what does nature have to do with literature and art, and how? Whether nature influences, informs, conditions literature and art. One would even say that even if a painter or a poet decides not to write about nature, is also a position in relation to nature. And the second issue, should literature be studied with reference to its physical surrounding? Thirdly, can literary theory be grounded in activism? Because environmentalism is primarily a form of activism. And unlike many other literary theories, apart from feminism and Marxism, eco-criticism has its one foot on activism and on the other and the other foot on analysis. And the last issue, can literary theory be used as a strategy for eco-defense? Eco-defense is a situation where one uses all one's strategies to defend all kinds of depletion and all kinds of atrocities committed on ecology and nature. Can we move ahead? Faiz sir, can we move ahead? Yeah, fine. So eco-criticism makes an attempt to read beyond some of these conventional dualism, and it is essential to identify the dualism that we carry. These are the conventional ones. One, we always find culture and nature at poles. Similarly, life and matter, because we use even in our language, we are not hesitant to use he or she when it comes to living things. But the pronoun that we use for matter is it. So this in a way tells that our entire metaphysics, our entire epistemology is a little lopsided when it comes to ecological concern, because we are informed by this binary that life is more important than what we call as non-living things. And again, it is debatable how non-living are the so-called non-living things. And then, of course, we have another binary, human and non-human. And obviously, the hierarchy is very clear. There is a kind of social ordering. There is also a kind of environmental ordering that we believe in, with human beings at the top and all other species being subordinated to him. Then we also look at rationality and reason on one side and animality and nature on the other side. So whatever is animalistic, animal-like, is considered inferior in a conventional thought process. And equally interesting is this binary between mind and body. We believe that mind and body are at the opposite ends of one's way of feeling and doing things. Reason and emotion is another binary. Then we also have this division between what is civilized and what is primitive. Master and slave is another, and male and female is also another binary. Now we are informed today that between what we call as masculine and feminine, there are possibly some 500 different gender positions. And our own limited understanding of genders make us adopt a binary like male and female. Sir, can we move ahead? All right. Once we insert nature in the agenda of literary criticism and theory, we get to study literary expressions in the larger context of some of the issues that we are facing. For example, there might be a question, why should a writer be concerned about global warming? Or why should a writer be concerned about pandemic and pollution? The answer is very simple. Because each and every writer and a thinker or a scholar is positioned in the very same world. And somebody at one point of time had pointed out that, see, I did not drill a hole in the ozone layer. So why should I be held responsible for all the consequences? The answer is very clear. One might not have done any damage, but one is not spared from the consequences of any of these backlashes. So literature necessarily by the 1980s, literary theorists were considering, like many other disciplines and under humanities and social sciences, that literary studies should also consider these elements. One is global warming, the effects of global warming. Now, what one finds as a reflection of this is there is a genre, there is a form of novel called polar fiction. Part of this polar fiction is all about the global meltdown that happens in the poles and the concern of a few scientists. Secondly, deforestation. Thirdly, we have in our agenda the issue of pollution and pandemic. I need not emphasize the point on pandemic because I'm sure the post-COVID era will redefine many things, including literary forms. To illustrate this a bit further, there is a literary form that we read avidly, that's travelogue, or what we call as travel memoir. That is going to be radically redefined because the very idea of traveling for the next 2 years will be redefined. And we know that it will be redefined largely in the context of this pandemic. Then decimation of species. We have been doing it for quite a bit of time. And we also know that one of the theories that has been circulating is that this entire COVID-19 has come from another species. And this virus is supposed to have made a jump across the species and mutated itself to affect the human beings. So our own accountability to other species and also the human-animal relationship are all going to be very, very significant in coming days. And next comes the animal rights. There is a very interesting interdisciplinary study called critical animal studies, which investigates, among many other things, the very interesting possibility of human-animal communication. And also the idea that all cultural expressions, by the term cultural expressions, I mean all poetry, literature, art, performing art, and so on, and their connection to the regional resources. For example, the metaphors that Shakespeare churns in his plays or in poetry, or the metaphors and images that one finds in a great poet like Pablo Neruda, are all the result, probably, they are all the results of the writer's close scrutiny of the regional resources. Could we move ahead? Eco-criticism is also known by certain other widely accepted terms, such as green cultural studies, eco-poetics, and environmental literary criticism. All these terms are very popular these days. Can we go ahead a little further? Yeah. I would also like to introduce some of the thinkers who have made a drastic impact and brought about a change in the perspective among the literary scholars. One primarily is Lawrence Buell, a wonderful scholar, and his work, among other works, The Environmental Imagination, which is a wonderful study of many literary traditions, including British Romanticism and the American Transcendentalism, and to show that how poets have been instrumental largely in many of the sustainable movements and many conservation movements across the world. Another seminal text is that of Cheryl Glotfelty, the Eco-Criticism Reader, Landmarks in Literary Ecology. And the introduction to this work, in fact, spells out the agenda and also the tenets of eco-criticism, a wonderful reading by itself. Carolyn Merchant takes this ecological thinking at a radical level in her work, In Search of a Livable Place, Radical Ecology. It's a wonderful text wherein she radicalizes ecological thinking by saying that tokenism is not enough and that human beings need to bring this entire process into their day-to-day life and literary practices. Scott Sklavich is another wonderful thinker, and his work, Literature and the Environment, a reader on nature and culture, is a very insightful study into this overlap of many cultures with ecocentric awareness. And one more text that I will reflect quickly on is that Gabriel Egan's Green Shakespeare, in which again finds out with a wonderful scrutiny some of the ecological messages that one finds in Shakespeare. For example, if one reads Tempest, apart from being it's set in an idyllic island, it also has a wonderful soundscape of its own, because soundscape is an extension of probably what we call as the ecology, and the sounds correspond to many lives. And what one finds in a play like The Tempest is Shakespeare's effective use of many sounds. For example, the sounds of human beings, the sounds of the creatures in the island. We also have a few supernatural creatures, and also the elemental sounds, the sound of the storm and so on. And even the play, in fact, begins with such an experience. So this opens up a wonderful study of Shakespeare's commitment to ecology. And what then an environmental awareness throws open to literary scholarship is an attempt to study the writer's commitment to the environment, the writer's commitment to the ecology and the bioregion, and largely to everything that to which the writer is connected. Can we move ahead? It is with this information that we could come to Glotfelty's statement on what is eco-criticism. What then is eco-criticism? Simply put, eco-criticism is a study of the relationship between literature and the physical environment. Just as feminist criticism examines language and literature from a gender-conscious perspective, and Marxist criticism brings an awareness of modes of production and economic class to its reading of text, eco-criticism takes an earth-centered approach to literary studies. Now, this earth-centered is a very loaded term, because everything that is there in our planet becomes a concern of the writer, and the biotic and the abiotic factors of our planet, they continuously interact, and they create many impulses, they create many contingencies, like the current pandemic crisis that we have. All of them are the indications that the planet is never static. Planet has its own intelligence, that it has its own moral considerations, and it there is a concept called environmental literacy. Environmental literacy is a kind of literacy wherein human beings become intelligent to understand the signs, SIGNS, signs of this nature and earth, and accordingly alter and change one's behavior. Sir, can we move ahead? All right. Glotfelty also points out a few questions in her seminal work, which are very central in understanding the role of a writer and a critic, or even a scholar, in the context of the environment. She points out that eco-critics and theorists ask questions, some of these questions. One, how is nature represented in a particular sonnet? What role does the physical setting play in the plot of a given novel? Are the values expressed in the play consistent with ecological wisdom? How do our metaphors of land influence the way we treat it? For example, when we use a metaphor, like say for example, if you say dumb as donkey, that shows our attitude to a donkey, an animal, because what is revealed is our inherent bias that a donkey is not a worthy animal to be treated with any respect. So these animal metaphors, or we might say that dead as dust, even the abiotic factors, non-living factors, are also considered with less moral consideration. So the metaphors reveal the way we treat the rest of the things around us. Then how can we characterize nature writing as a genre? Can we say that nature writing is a subgenre within fiction, within poetry? For example, in poetry, pastoral writing is considered to be a subgenre with a very dominant presence of nature. Then, in addition to race, class, and gender, should plays become a new critical category? So far, we have been looking at these very, very interesting vectors of analysis: race, class, and gender. Can plays, can the geography, can the bioregion from which the poem springs or a play springs be considered? For example, it could be applied even to the urban literature. An urban piece of work which doesn't have any nature, overt presence of nature, can also be analyzed with this perspective on place. Sir, can we move ahead? Glotfelty continues with some of these questions, and she asks another interesting question: do men write about nature differently than women do? Now, this is a lead for ecofeminism. Do men and women feel about nature the same way or not? Do men and women feel about animals and other species in the same way? Then, in what ways has literacy itself affected humankind's relation to natural world? For example, literacy has led to what called one inevitable factor that we all share, that there is something called nomenclature. For example, we have names for things, and we do not accept anything without name. And always remember, the name that we give to a species, for example, a whale or a shark, is not that they have chosen. These are the names that human beings have created for their own purpose of taxonomy or classification. And I believe that any attempt to do that is an attempt to reduce the personhood of that species. Then, how has the concept of wilderness changed over a period of time? this notion is largely a Western notion, wilderness. We could replace that with jungle in Indian context. Has it changed over a period of time? Definitely yes, because what was wild in America has been continuously redefined with the shrinking of the West. Similar things have happened in, I think, other cultures across the world. Then, in what ways and to what effect is the environmental crisis seeping into contemporary literature and popular culture? One of the examples of that is how popular art has taken environmental issue. For a very easy recognition for all of you, there's a wonderful song by Michael Jackson called Life Song. It begins with the line, what will happen to the animals, to the planet, to the lives. So it is his tribute to the shrinking natural resources, and this song became very popular. So that's one example where even popular culture addresses environmental issues. Can we move ahead? Yeah. Sir, can we go to the next slide? Yeah. The basic premises of eco-criticism include everything that is physically quantifiable, living and non-living. And this is the major premise that one finds in this work that I was talking about, the introductory essay, Literary Studies in an Age of Environmental Crisis.